Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about the Protestant Reformation in England. And so first I'm going to set the context. Towards the end of the 15th century, there's a long and confusing and bloody civil war in England, and at the end of the day, the Tudor dynasty emerges as the new ruling dynasty in England. But the Tudors kind of come to the game late, and they don't have a particularly strong claim to the English throne. And so the Tudors are always going to be worried about stability and making sure their dynasty has a stable plan of succession, or protecting their own rule. At the same time, most people in England at the time are tired of this period of civil war, and so they look to the Tudors to provide them with security, and they're willing to give Tudor monarchs more power than English monarchs have enjoyed previously in order to avoid another civil war. And so we begin with the first Tudor monarch, Henry VII. And Henry VII again is concerned for his stability, and he wants an ally, and he wants heirs, or he wants to provide for his heirs. And so he arranges to marry his oldest son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain. Spain, the rising new power in the world with a powerful empire. This will be a good way to prevent the French from attacking England, or a good ally to have if the French do attack the English. But then Arthur dies. Unfortunately, Henry VII has another son named Henry, who he is able to marry to Catherine of Aragon. Henry VII dies. He's succeeded by Henry VIII, and you probably know, or most of you probably know, where this story is going. Henry becomes increasingly dissatisfied over the course of his marriage that although Catherine has provided him with a daughter, Mary, she has not provided him with a son, thereby ensuring the stability of the Tudor dynasty. Remember, this is what the Tudors are worried about. And Henry increasingly tries to argue that in some way his marriage to Catherine was invalid, and that he should be free to marry one of his mistresses, Anne Boleyn. However, when he submits to the Pope for a certificate of annulment to say that his marriage was invalid, that he's free to marry someone else, the Pope refuses. And so Henry, in trying to put pressure on the Pope, puts the steps in motion towards separating the English church from the papacy, separating Christianity in England from the papacy. He appoints a new Archbishop of Canterbury, who was the chief bishop in England at this time, and this man by the name of Thomas Cranmer is a secret Lutheran. Now, Henry VIII didn't know this, and Henry VIII had no time for Lutherans. He persecuted and executed many, many Lutherans. He doesn't know this, but Cranmer makes sure that Henry knows that Cranmer is the king's man before he's the Pope's man. And so Cranmer, working with Henry and working with the Parliament, established a series of reforms that set out that the church in England is no longer under the jurisdiction of the Pope, but under the jurisdiction of the King and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is Cranmer. Once Parliament agrees to this, and they agree to this because, as I said, most people in England want to give Henry what he wants, so that they don't have to deal with another period of civil war. Once Parliament agrees to this, Cranmer goes ahead, gives Henry a divorce. Henry marries Anne Boleyn and exiles Catherine to another part of his kingdom. Anne, however, gives birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, and Henry becomes convinced that he's been cursed by God for having an affair with Anne, for divorcing his marriage with Catherine, and so he has Anne executed. Shortly after this, Catherine of Aragon dies, and Henry marries again. He marries a lady called Jane Seymour, who gives birth to a son. Finally, from Henry's perspective, a son named Edward. However, Jane Seymour dies shortly after the birth, and Edward is a sickly child, and so Henry feels as though he needs to marry again. I'm not going to go into the details of the three subsequent marriages, but suffice it to say that one of them is executed, one of them is divorced, and finally the sixth wife, Catherine Parr, outlives Henry. When Henry dies, he is succeeded by his son Edward. Edward's still a teenager at this point. He's a sickly child. He will only rule for about 7 years, and he's going to be dominated by Kramer, the secret Lutheran, who now more overtly promotes Protestant theology. So up until this point, under Henry's leadership, the Church in England had become separate from the papacy, but still believed and practiced the same things. But now, under Edward and under Kramer's direction, the English Church starts to adopt Lutheran and Calvinist theology. After Edward dies, he's succeeded by his half-sister Mary. Now remember, Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She's been raised a Catholic. She's been raised in the traumatic circumstances of her parents' very public and humiliating divorce. And she wants to restore England as a Catholic country. So she restores relations with the papacy. She marries a Spanish king, hopes to give birth to a Catholic heir with him, but they have no children. And Mary becomes convinced that she is being punished for tolerating, because she didn't make Protestantism in England illegal, she just made Catholicism the official religion. She feels as though she's being punished for tolerating Protestantism, for tolerating this erroneous form of Christianity. And so she begins persecuting Protestants and executing those Protestants who refuse to reject their faith. And it's because of this that she's known as Bloody Mary by some people. After Mary dies, and again, she comes to the throne late, she has a relatively short rule, she's succeeded by her half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. And Elizabeth is much more concerned about her own stability. She's kind of like a Tudor in that way, but not like a Tudor in that she's more concerned about her own stability than she is about settling the religious question necessarily one way or the other. And so the settlement that she comes to, which we refer to as the Anglican settlement, establishment of the Anglican religion, is a settlement that gives her the most power. A Catholic-style hierarchy, but without the Pope. Instead, with her at the head of this hierarchy. This is the way to ensure that she has the greatest control over religion, and there's not going to be a religious uprising against her. She also establishes a system of fines for those who refuse to attend approved state services on Sundays. And now we come in contact with Elizabeth's cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, who initially had been married to the King of France. And when he dies, she returns to Scotland, but here she finds that Calvinist missionaries have become very powerful and they drive her out of Scotland, partly because she has a somewhat tawdry personal life, partly because she's a Catholic, partly because she's a woman. And Mary, Queen of Scots, flees from Scotland and comes to her cousin Elizabeth in England seeking her help. And Elizabeth is in a difficult situation at this point because Mary represents a real threat to her. She is next in line to the throne, and she's Catholic. It's going to be very tempting for a substantial part of the population in England that still practices Catholicism to try and overthrow Elizabeth and replace her with Mary. So Mary is a threat who Elizabeth wants out of the way. But Elizabeth also doesn't want to set the precedent that you can start killing queens. And so Elizabeth just keeps Mary imprisoned. However, Mary remains a focal point for Catholic unrest against Elizabeth's measures. So in 1569, there is a rebellion against Elizabeth, a Catholic rebellion against Elizabeth, trying to overthrow her and put Mary on the throne. This is Elizabeth's worst nightmare. She punishes the rebellion with great severity. This in turn convinces the Pope of the time, Pius V, that there was no way that Elizabeth would ever return the Church in England to Catholicism. There had been a sort of hope that this might be the case. Elizabeth had promised Mary, her sister, her half-sister, that she would do this, but now it seems like that's not going to happen. And so Pius V declares Elizabeth excommunicate, which legitimates her subjects rising up and rebelling against her. And so Elizabeth feels as though she has to respond, and she responds by a series of measures that make Catholicism illegal, and eventually make it illegal to be a Catholic priest. And she, like her half-sister, ends up executing many hundreds of Catholic priests and Catholics who were hiding or supporting Catholic priests during this period. Nevertheless, from Elizabeth's perspective, this program is successful. And in 1586, Mary's son, James, who's been raised by Protestants in Scotland as a Protestant, turns 18, and he's now the king. Mary, Queen of Scots, is no longer really a queen, and Elizabeth is able to have her executed. She's got rid of the two main threats to her authority. However, there is one more threat. Those are the two internal threats to Elizabeth's authority. There's one more external threat to her authority. And that's the threat of the Kingdom of Spain, the Empire of Spain, leader of the Catholic world at the time, and led, and also England's chief economic rival. And so the English have been attacking Spanish colonies and the wealth of Spanish colonies in the New World. They've been promoting Protestant rebellions against Spain in Europe. Now they've executed Mary, Queen of Scots. Philip, the King of Spain, who was the husband of Mary Tudor, Elizabeth's half-sister, feels that it is his duty and feels that he has no option if he's going to secure Spanish territory in the New World, if he is going to put down these Protestant rebellions in Europe, but to invade England. And so he attempts to invade England by using a naval force called the Spanish Armada. And remember, Spain is the leading power in the world at this point. Nevertheless, in the years since Columbus's discovery of the Americas, the English also have been exploring the Atlantic, establishing themselves as a seafaring nation. And they meet the Spanish Armada and defeat them because their navy is superior. And this is a significant moment because it marks the beginnings of England surpassing Spain as the leading power in Western civilization. And it secures Elizabeth's reign until the end of her life in 1603. It secures Protestantism as the official religion in England, at least for the moment. That's a lot of information, but I hope it's helpful as you're studying the Reformation in England.